Please subscribe and share for more story. You mean your mother already left? Then who's paying? The sharp voice cut through the soft jazz like broken glass. Every head in the restaurant turned. Servers froze mid-step, trays hovering in the air. This was supposed to be Lena Carter's birthday dinner, 32 years old, perfectly styled, carefully photographed. 15 friends, designer outfits, an expensive menu. At the far end of the table sat Margaret Hale, 62, quiet, holding a glass of tap water. She had risen moments earlier, clutching her worn handbag, intending to excuse herself politely. Instead, she walked straight past the hostess stand, through the glass doors, and into the cold Seattle drizzle. A taxi idled at the curb, headlights glowing like permission. Margaret didn't look back. Not at the unpaid bill. Not at her son Ethan's panic. Not at Lena's furious complaint about a ruined aesthetic. The walk to the taxi felt endless. But when the door shut and the car pulled away, Margaret inhaled deeply. For the first time in 3 years she could breathe. That exit was only the beginning. At 2:15 a.m., Ethan burst into Margaret's small craftsman bungalow, breath ragged, voice cracked. "Mom," he shouted, fear overriding anger. He expected tears, excuses, maybe her curled in bed, ashamed. Instead, she sat calmly in her wingback chair, lights dim, posture steady. 3 packed suitcases lined the wall. A thick manila envelope rested on the coffee table like a verdict. Margaret folded her hands in her lap. She had known they would come, fueled by embarrassment and entitlement. She knew they expected her to apologize, to fix the financial disaster, to resume her role as rescuer. But the woman in that chair was no longer the one they had trained to comply. At 62, Margaret had finally stepped out of the role of convenient mother. She had learned how to say no, and meant it. This wasn't a sudden decision. Ethan would later call it irrational and dramatic, but Margaret knew better. It was erosion, not explosion. Years of small humiliations. Months of swallowed pride. A dangerous belief that loving your child meant erasing yourself. The pattern began 2 years earlier, on a rainy Tuesday. Ethan called with that familiar tone, the wounded child voice. "Mom, I hate asking," he said. Margaret's heart raced. Illness? Accident? Instead, it was money. "We're short on the mortgage. Just $600. Until next month." Margaret hesitated only long enough to feel guilty. "Of course," she said. "He promised repayment. He didn't follow through." The requests continued, repairs, dinners, memberships. Each time she asked about repayment, Ethan sighed. "I thought you helped us because you loved us." The words worked. She stopped asking. They stopped pretending. Visits changed too. Gone were quiet Sundays and shared meals. Now Ethan only appeared when money was involved. His wife Lena rarely came, and when she did, she treated Margaret's home like a waiting room. One evening, they arrived unannounced with takeout. "Save the stew," Ethan said, taking over the kitchen. Lena scrolled on her phone, criticized the wine, ignored Margaret's questions. They talked about parties, influencers, people Margaret had never met. When they finished eating, Ethan leaned back. "We found a wellness retreat in Sedona," he said brightly. "It's perfect. But we have to book tonight." Margaret felt the familiar dread. "How much?" $2,500. Margaret explained she couldn't. Lena looked up coldly. "What's more important than your son's mental health?" Margaret transferred the money that night. They left with the wine. She cried alone. Not for the money, but for the truth. While they posted photos from Sedona, Margaret got sick. A severe flu kept her bedridden for days. Her neighbor brought soup and medicine. "Where's your son?" the woman asked gently. Margaret answered quietly. When Ethan returned, the requests increased. A new couch, a larger apartment. "Think of it as an investment," he said. She paid the deposit. She helped them move. She scrubbed floors for 12 hours. Ethan didn't offer her a ride home. "Just grab an Uber," he said. They never reimbursed her. Margaret rode 2 buses in the rain, knees aching, heart breaking. Still, she went when Lena summoned her to the birthday dinner. She wore her best dress and her mother's pearls. She wanted to look like she mattered. The dinner was obscene. Champagne towers, seafood platters, laughter that felt rehearsed. Ethan played the successful executive. Lena held court. Margaret sat unnoticed at the end of the table. When the bill arrived, silence fell. Ethan's face drained. He whispered urgently to Lena. Then Lena looked down the table. Margaret, she called sharply. Come here. Ethan lowered his voice. The bill's $1,200. We can cover half. Can you take the rest? I don't have it, Margaret said softly. Don't start, he hissed. Lena raised her voice. Are you really embarrassing us over money? What do you do for me? Margaret asked quietly. The cruelty that followed was public and surgical. Ethan begged. Lena scoffed. Something inside Margaret broke, cleanly. I'm going to the restroom, she said. She walked out instead. Now, back in her living room, Margaret slid the envelope forward. Ethan opened it, hands shaking. His face went gray. You sold the house. Yes, Margaret said. 3 weeks ago. Lena screamed. That was our inheritance. It was my house, Margaret replied. You never owned it. Where's the money? Ethan demanded. I paid my debts. I kept enough to relocate. The rest I donated. To who? To a shelter for victims of financial and emotional abuse. Silence swallowed the room. You're insane, Lena shouted. No, Margaret said. I'm free. Ethan pleaded. They were broke. Maxed out. Desperate. Then you'll rebuild, Margaret said calmly. Like adults. She picked up her purse. My taxi's coming. You'll die alone, Lena spat. Margaret looked at her with pity. I'd rather be alone than used. She walked out. By morning, she was in Oregon. Her sister Ruth waited at the small airport. Margaret collapsed into her arms and cried for everything she had lost and everything she had gained. Ruth gave her space, quiet. Healing came slowly. Margaret found work at a used bookstore. She made friends who listened. She walked the beach, collected sea glass, relearned silence. Ethan tried to reach her. Ruth filtered it out. 6 months passed. Then a year. One July afternoon, the doorbell rang. Ethan stood on the porch, thinner, older. Beside him was a woman holding a baby carrier. Mom, he said softly. Margaret didn't move. This is Clara, he said. And my daughter, June. They sat on the porch. Ethan told the truth. Bankruptcy. Warehouse work. Bianca gone. I didn't come for money, he said quickly. I came to say I'm sorry. He handed her an envelope. $50. A payment plan. Margaret looked at him, then at the baby. Can I hold her? She asked. Yes, Clara smiled. Holding June, Margaret felt something new. Peace. I accept your apology, she said. But things are different. I understand, Ethan said. That night, they shared a simple dinner. No performance. Just honesty. When they left, Margaret stood in the quiet house, holding the envelope. $50. It wasn't about the amount. It was about respect. She opened the window, listening to the ocean. She thought about the night she walked out, the fear, the guilt, the strength it took to choose herself. Love, she realized, was an endless sacrifice. Love required boundaries. Sometimes the bravest thing a mother can do is let go. She had saved herself. And in doing so, she had given her son the chance to become whole. Margaret slept deeply, finally at peace. Life in Oregon did not soften Margaret overnight. The quiet felt unnatural at first, like a room after a storm, when the ringing in your ears hasn't faded. She woke each morning expecting her phone to buzz with panic. Rent due, card declined, some manufactured emergency that required her to bleed a little more. Instead, there was only sea wind and the distant cry of gulls. You're safe, Ruth reminded her gently one morning as they drank tea on the porch. Margaret nodded, but safety felt unfamiliar. Freedom, she learned, could be terrifying before it became peaceful. The bookstore job grounded her. You don't owe anyone anything here, the owner, Elaine, told her on the first day. Margaret shelved novels, rang up dog-eared paperbacks, and talked to strangers who actually listened. One afternoon a woman said, "You explain books like you've lived them." Margaret smiled sadly. "I have." For the first time in years, she felt useful without being drained. No one asked her for money. No one tested her boundaries. That absence felt like oxygen. 6 months passed before Ruth mentioned Ethan again. "He called," she said carefully. "Didn't leave a message." Margaret's stomach tightened, then settled. "I'm not ready," she said. Ruth nodded. "That's allowed." Margaret walked the beach that evening, watching waves break and retreat. She realized something startling. She no longer missed the version of her son that had existed before. She missed the child he used to be, not the man he had chosen to become. When Ethan finally stood on the porch a year later, Margaret recognized exhaustion before she recognized him. His shoulders sagged, his confidence stripped away. "I know I don't deserve 5 minutes," he said quickly, "but I'm asking for one." Margaret didn't invite him inside. She listened. That alone was an act of restraint. He spoke without interruption for the first time in his adult life. Bankruptcy. Sleeping in his car. Warehouse shifts that broke his hands open. "I blamed you at first," he admitted. "Then I ran out of people to blame." Clara stayed quiet, holding the baby like an anchor. When Margaret finally looked at the child, something in her chest loosened. "She's beautiful," Margaret said. Ethan exhaled shakily. "Her name is June." Margaret reached out but stopped herself. "May I?" she asked. The question mattered. Clara smiled and nodded. As Margaret held the baby, she felt no obligation, only choice. The difference stunned her. "I'm not here to fix my life," Ethan said quickly. "I'm here because I broke yours." He pulled out the envelope. "I'll send what I can. Not because you asked. Because I owe it." Margaret didn't open it. "This doesn't buy forgiveness," she said calmly. "I know," he replied. "It buys accountability." The word hung between them, heavy and sincere. Margaret nodded once. It was enough for that day. Over dinner, Ethan washed dishes without being asked. Ruth watched silently, then later whispered, "He's different." Margaret nodded. Different didn't mean healed. Different didn't mean safe. But it meant aware. When Ethan laughed, it wasn't loud or performative. It was quiet, uncertain, real. Margaret felt something unfamiliar bloom. Not hope exactly, but possibility with boundaries wrapped tightly around it. After they left, Margaret sat alone with the envelope on her lap. $50. She laughed softly, shaking her head. "You finally learned," she murmured. The money didn't restore what had been lost. It restored something better, balance. She placed the envelope in a drawer, not as payment, but as proof that change was possible without her suffering. That night, Margaret wrote in a notebook Ruth had given her, "Love without limits is not love. It is surrender." She thought about the lies she had lived under for decades, that motherhood required erasure. She saw now how that belief had starved both her and her son. Walking away hadn't been cruelty. It had been correction. As the ocean breathed steadily outside her window, Margaret understood the final truth. Boundaries did not destroy families. Silence did. Enabling did. Fear did. She had not abandoned her child that night in Seattle. She had stopped abandoning herself. And in doing so, she had finally taught her son the lesson no sacrifice ever could. Love must stand upright, or it collapses into control. Weeks passed after Ethan's visit, and Margaret noticed something subtle but profound. Peace no longer felt fragile. It settled into her bones. She and Ruth developed easy routines, morning walks, shared grocery lists, quiet evenings with crossword puzzles and old movies. One afternoon Ruth said, "You're lighter." Margaret smiled. "I stopped carrying what was never mine." The truth of it felt solid. She no longer rehearsed conversations in her head or braced herself for disappointment. Her life was small, yes, but it was hers. Ethan kept his word. Each month, a small envelope arrived. $50. Sometimes $70. Always with a note. "Still working overtime. June laughed today." Margaret never responded with advice. Only brief acknowledgments. "Thank you. Take care." She refused to slip back into management or rescue. When Ruth asked if it was hard, Margaret shook her head. What was hard was loving him while disappearing. This is easier. This is honest. One afternoon at the bookstore, a woman asked Margaret why she always smiled when shelving parenting books. Margaret considered the question. Because they remind me that children grow best when they're allowed to struggle, she said. The woman nodded slowly. Margaret realized she no longer felt shame when speaking about her past. It had become a lesson, not a wound. On June's first birthday, a small card arrived with a crayon scribble taped inside. Margaret held it for a long time. She did not rush to claim a role. She understood now that love offered freely was far more powerful than love demanded. She sent a simple gift, a handmade sweater, soft and practical. No grand gestures. No expectations attached. Some nights, Margaret still thought about the restaurant in Seattle. The unpaid bill, the humiliation, the courage it took to stand up and walk out alone. She no longer replayed it with pain, but with gratitude. That moment had been the doorway to her life. As she turned off the lamp and listened to the ocean roll steadily in the dark, Margaret smiled. She had learned the hardest truth too many learned too late. Love does not require self-destruction. And freedom, once chosen, teaches everyone else how to grow.